Well, thank you very much for this warm welcome. I'd like to start out thanking you for inviting me to come here. It's an honor to be here. And obviously, I would like to thank everybody for attending this talk. I'm honored by this. I would like to start out by saying what I would like to talk about and how to take what I'm saying and how not to take it. Since the financial crisis broke out, I'm getting lots of analyst reports all the time. And the thing that has changed since is that attached to the analyst report is always a huge disclaimer in which I'm advised not to make any investment decisions only based on the information that is given by the report, that the authors are not responsible for the consequences of what they are saying, and that I should seek other advice before making any decisions. And I think it's actually, sometimes the disclaimer is longer than the report itself. I would actually like to start by saying a similar thing. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. I'm not speaking on behalf of the government. I'm not a spokesman for Germany. I'm an observer who has followed European affairs for quite some time. Perhaps to say a few things about me, I started being a correspondent in Paris in the mid-90s when the Stability and Growth Pact was worked out between Kohl and Chirac and later on Schröder and Chirac. Then I moved on to Berlin when the EU constitution was drawn up between Schröder and Chirac still, and Fischer, importantly as well. It failed, and I was in Brussels when the repair job for turning the constitution into the Lisbon Treaty was undertaken. I was in Brussels as well when the financial crisis broke out, and I am in Frankfurt since a couple of weeks only, since January, following the euro and monetary policy and international finance. So I've had different perspectives, and that's the perspective I'm speaking from, just to be clear about this. Perhaps a word on my newspaper. Financial Times Deutschland is an economic daily in Germany. It was founded in 1999 between Pearson, the publishing group between Financial Times and Gruner & Jahr, which is the biggest German publishing house. Pearson decided roughly 3 years ago to sell off all its non-English language publications. They had Expansion in Spain, Les Echos in France, and they had a 50% stake in our paper. So Gruner & Jahr took over the 50% and is now the sole owner, and we have a license agreement with them, meaning that we have a contractual relationship with them and no longer a capitalistic relationship. But we do share content, so we're still cooperating, but we are no longer the same company. Yes, on the topic, I hope I can operate this. Will Merkel transform the Eurozone into a German Europe? That's the question I wanted to ask myself and discuss with you, offer you a few thoughts, and then I hope to engage in a discussion with you. I will try to structure my talk by lining out the domestic constraints under which Angela Merkel is operating at the moment. Then I would like to explain how the debate on the EU and the Eurozone in the context of the crisis has changed the perception of Europe and the Euro in Germany and political mood in Germany towards Europe as a whole. I will insist a little bit on the Greek crisis because I think the Greek crisis was a game changer in Germany in this regard, much more than later on the discussions about Ireland. I will then try to explain how I think the current mood influences the decisions that Merkel the government is about to take at the moment in the context of the Euro crisis and the reform of the Eurozone governance. And I will try to draw a couple of lessons from that. And then I'm looking forward to discussing my thoughts with you, hoping to have provoked a lively discussion afterwards. Let me just start out with this graph, which is from The Economist, and since it was in English, I just took it because I think it's useful. All politics is always local, or in the European context, you could say all politics is, in a way, national, and this is the agenda that Merkel is facing. She has 7 regional elections coming up this year of different importance, but all in a way are important for her because, as you know, Germany is a federal state. The federal governments are represented in the second chamber. The majority has already changed in disfavor to the current ruling coalition, meaning that there is another majority than the center of the right majority in the second chamber. And the political mood is volatile in Germany. Merkel may seem very authoritative from the outside, but her coalition and also I think her personal authority has been diminished by a number of events that have happened recently and are still ongoing. So this is quite important for her, and I think to understand what Merkel does in the European context, you have to bear in mind that her action is probably at least as much, otherwise even more, guided by those 7 dates than by the content of the decisions that have to be taken. Last Sunday was the first of the round of elections that I'm referring to. I'm sorry, this should be 2011, it was on Sunday. And it was a very bad result for Angela Merkel. The CDU, the Christian Democrats, she dropped down to 22%, which is less than half, or it's about half of what she got last time. The opposition Social Democrats almost at 50% with an absolute majority. That is the result in 2008, sort of the inverse. Now, I would caution to draw too many conclusions from this, because it is an election of a city-state with 2.5 million people. Many of the reasons for the election results were on a city municipal basis, but in a way it shows a trend at the moment. Her government is not very popular. I think I have another graph here showing those are the polls that are being taken regularly. It's called the Sunday question, in which several pollsters always ask if next Sunday an election was going to take place, who would you vote for? And it's clear that her ruling coalition, which is comprised of CDU, CSU and FDP, would not have a majority. They would be just about the same strength as SPD and the Greens combined. But you can also see that the Greens and SPD the SPD is much lower on a national level than they were in the Hamburg elections. So that is an illustration of the fact that the Hamburg elections do not necessarily show a national trend. They should just show that CDU, the Christian Democrats, are in big difficulty. So I think her position is fragile, and she in anything that she does, she has to take that into account. I will now try to talk a little bit about Greece, because I think Greece was very important in understanding the current European policy stance of the German government of Angela Merkel. In order to understand what happened in the first half of last year, I think it's important to understand how Germany perceived itself prior to that. I think if you look at the German political scene and the people responsible for European policy, say in 2006, 2007, 2008, the general feeling was that Germany had achieved, one could say, all its strategic goals within Europe. You had a peaceful reunification in agreement with the EU and all the neighbors. Germany was, by that, geographically in the center of Europe. It had obviously acquired the status of the most populous country, the biggest economy by far. The single currency then came, which was done according to rules that were, to a very big extent, according to what Germany had on a national level, especially the arrangements for the independence of the central bank, and the no bailout clause and all the rule books surrounding the euro. The single market provided for an export-oriented economy, such as the German economy, a great way to do business. Enlargement, I already mentioned. The EU constitution, later on called the Lisbon Treaty, but in substance very much the same, is an institutional arrangement that was to the advantage of Germany, because Germany institutionally gained weight in the decision-making procedures. So the general feeling was we have achieved our aims, and in a way Germany, I think it would be fair to describe Germany in European terms as a status quo power. It did not have any longer, also given the difficulties that we had encountered ratifying the Constitution and later on Lisbon Treaty, did not have any grand designs for huge new treaty changes, did not talk about visions how Europe should be in 10 or 15 years, but was rather content having what the status quo brought. And in that context, the European, the financial crisis came to Europe. It started out 2007, obviously, but then with the weekend in September when Lehman collapsed, within the night it came over to Europe, and it was all of a sudden a big European crisis. And I think the debate about how to handle Greece put into question almost everything that I just described earlier on. The feeling that we had created in accord with our EU partners an arrangement that very much was to our advantage. And that really caused something that went to the roots of the German European policy consensus and shook that rather abruptly. So Merkel, in that situation in 2010, I would say February, March, when the Greek crisis started to become a really big topic, posed herself as the defender of the virtues of the Euro rules as described earlier. There was also a domestic policy consideration. There was a very important election coming up in North Rhine-Westphalia, which is the most populous federal state in Germany. If it was a member of the EU, it would probably be the 7th or 8th largest member state with 18 million people. And the Christian Democrats were ruling that member state, that federal state. So part of her behavior, I don't say everything, but part of that was also tactical in the sense that she didn't want to offset voters in this May election. And I took a cartoon from Bild Zeitung because that nicely shows how she tried to, in a bit of a vicious way, shows how she tried to portray herself. She tried to be sort of the Iron Chancellor in the Eurozone. That was the image that she wanted to give by saying there will be no bailouts. She very much talked in moralistic and almost theological terms. She said that deficit sinners would have to pay for their sins. That is really the words that she sometimes employed. And she was applauded by big parts of the public and German media during that time. So, and I don't know if she thought that she would be able to hold that strategy until May, because today clearly we know that she didn't. But in February and March, that was more or less the line that she took, and I think she got credit for that with many people, with many observers. In Europe, obviously, the image, this is a different slide, I come to that. The debate within Germany and Greece got very ugly, which is illustrated by the cover page of Focus, which is a news magazine. It sells 700,000 or 800,000 copies a week. It really made the Greek upset, and despite the fact that Greek and German relations historically since the war have been excellent, there has been historic resentment. There were arguments rolled out that Germany still owed war reparation debt, and the response from journalistic terms was this cartoon or photo montage showing a statue from the Brandenburg Gate holding a swastika. So it really descended to a very low level, which was certainly an unintended consequence of the strategy that was pursued by the government, but it showed how thin the civilizational layer between European countries can be when it comes to emotional questions. The applause that Germany got that Merkel got in Germany was countered by, this is a cartoon from the Financial Times, which I think shows quite accurately what many people at that time wrote and said about Merkel. In a way, Merkel had been a very popular. I was in Brussels back then when all this happened, and I was always struck by the positive image that Merkel had. She was considered, perhaps partly because she was a woman in such a powerful position, but also because in the first years of government, she really had convincing European policies during the German presidency with the climate package and all that. People were shocked by her behavior, where in a way many people were reminded of Margaret Thatcher in the 80s, early 90s, with her handbag and her "I want my money back." So this was the opposite side from a European perspective. Then Merkel had to manage the turnaround in negotiations when it became clear that Greece, there have to be a solution for Greece before the elections in North Rhine-Westphalia, which were May 10. And this turnaround, I don't think she was unable to communicate this turnaround. Obviously, as you remember, this extremely important weekend between 8th of May and the 10th of May, first of all, it was decided on a Friday to agree on a bailout package for Greece. And then on Sunday, the EFSF, the European Rescue Fund, was agreed upon, including the decision of the European Central Bank to initiate a bond buying program, which was considered outrageous in Germany. And Merkel, because of the stance she had taken before that, Iron Chancellor and all that, was not at all in a position to explain the turnaround, which was the opposite, actually, of what she had stood for before. The result of that, I didn't find the page. I would have liked to download as a real page. This is Bild-Zeitung, which is the mass circulation daily. It sells about 3 million copies a day, and it's read by about 10 million people a day. So it really is the most influential publication in Germany. If you translate that was a headline that ran across the entire page, and it says, "Once again, we are the fools of Europe." And I think the reason why I'm putting this here is because I think it captured popular mood. Many people in Germany back then believed that the Germans had been lied to in the 90s when the euro was explained with the arguments that I mentioned earlier, and that we are now in a monetary union that we have never signed up to, that the Bundestag had not voted for, and that were not according to the principles that had been agreed upon. And that was a serious, very serious, I think, political public relations problem for Merkel. She lost quite in an important manner the election that took place, ironically, the same day as the decision in Brussels to create the European Rescue Fund, May 10. She really had a public relation problem. That problem was aggravated by the fact that all the historic figures of the euro creation went out publicly against that. Not only Axel Weber, Bundesbank president, broke the rule of the ECB not to criticize the decisions taken by the ECB Council and said that he was critical of the decision to start the bond buying program. But you also had people like Carlo Topöl, former president of the Bundesbank, and Hans Tietmeyer, and Josef Ackermann, who is the CEO of Deutsche Bank, all saying things that were extremely unhelpful for Merkel and the political establishment, saying that Pöhl said, now the Germans are going to pay for everything. Tietmeyer very recently still said that we are in breach with the spirit of the EU treaty. And Josef Ackermann, I think, the weekend after the decision for Greece, in which the government tried to insist and explain the decision by saying it's only credits and we'll get it back and there will even be interest rates. Ackermann went on television saying the Greeks won't be able to pay back. You will have to write off part of that. So all of that put the government into a really difficult situation in which it struggled to. That's the wrong button. Struggled to come across with its message. Der Spiegel is, I would say, the German equivalent, one could say, to the Economist. It's a very serious newspaper. It's very influential. 1 million copies sold each week, readership a lot higher. They had three title stories within a couple of months. This is the Euro lie, this is Euroland has burned down. There is another one more recently. This is the last battle, how Europe is ruining its currency. And you can imagine that this, together with Bild Zeitung, this is not, the articles were very factual. This was not populism like Bild Zeitung did, but it was critical, and the effects of this were clearly that there was a huge disenchantment of public opinion with the euro and the European idea. And I like to illustrate that a little bit. There's a very good poll taken by the first public German television station, ARD. They have consistently taken that poll over the last 10 years since the introduction practically of the euro, and the last one is from December 2010. It's in German, so I will just explain. They ask, do you see rather advantages or rather inconveniences with the introduction of the euro? 32% of Germans answered rather advantages, 60% rather inconveniences. But what's more interesting, this is the timeline when they started in January 2001, I think. The spread between those who saw advantages and those who saw inconveniences was considerable, but still smaller than today. 32% advantages, 45% inconveniences. Today we are still at 32, that hasn't moved, but the latest poll was 60%. So you could say there has been an erosion process in the legitimization of the euro that has taken place over the past 10 years, which is astonishing. When I looked at that at first, when I was doing research for my paper at Bruegel, I was really astonished, because I would have thought that in the beginning perhaps they were unhappy. But given that the euro fared well, inflation was low, and all the advantages that were attached to the mark basically had applied to the euro as well, they might have been convinced. But actually, the level of discontent rose even during that time and reached highs in the crisis. So this is something I think you have to keep in mind when you think about German politicians dealing with problems of the eurozone. It's just extremely unpopular. This is another poll, and this poll is also not taken by some Eurosceptic organization, but it's the Barometer, done by an institute on behalf of the European Commission. The red line it's very difficult to read. The blue line is you tend to trust the EU, and the red line you tend not to trust. And Germany is now just in front of the UK, the country where the most Eurosceptics are, according to this poll. So that is also an important fact. I think you should bear in mind when you discuss or when you think about the stances German government takes on European issues. This is a poll that has been just published by another German newspaper, the Frankfurt Zeitung, in which they asked how much trust people have in the EU in very general terms. The blue line is I have a very big trust in the EU. It's 25%, and the red line is not so much trust or no trust at all, which is 67%. So all of this is going in the same direction, that the EU and the Eurozone is a project that has a huge credibility and legitimacy problem with the German population. This question is, do you agree or not agree with the statement, Europe is our future? Here the spread is not so big, but still 34% agree, do not agree, and 41% agree. So there is still a majority agreeing with that, but the dynamics is clear. Those who do not agree, who think it's the future, is declining steeply, while those who think it's not our future has almost doubled. Yeah, this is later. Well, I leave it here. Now I would like to come a little bit to the debate that we are having today. I think as I tried to point out, all of this was more or less what happened last year during the Greek crisis, the crisis around Greece, which I think was really changing attitudes. Since then, things have calmed down, and the debate is being conducted on a more rational level due to the fact that the European Rescue Fund has been institutionalized. The vote that has taken place for Greece and for the creation of the fund does not have to be repeated for individual countries as long as it is within the fund as agreed upon. So when the question arose about Ireland being a part of the fund and receiving money from the fund, there did not need to be a discussion in Bundestag and more crucially a vote in Bundestag. The debates around Ireland, they certainly, I wasn't here, but I imagine they were very passionate here in this country, but they were rather calm compared to the Greek debate in Germany. However, there are other caveats I should mention, especially one constraint that Merkel is operating under, which doesn't have anything to do with what I've talked about so far, which is the Constitutional Court in Germany. The Constitutional Court in Germany is an institution that is probably, since the Bundesbank more or less was dissolved within the Euro system, enjoying the highest reputation of all public institutions there are in Germany. It's an institution that is interfering in political debate to an extent which is, I think, difficult to imagine in many other countries. Perhaps in the US sometimes it's quite similar, but in most other countries, a constitutional court does not have so much influence. And they had a ruling in June 2009 that was on the question as to whether or not the Lisbon Treaty was in line with the German constitution. They said yes, but they added a number of caveats and limited the margin of maneuver in what the government could decide, and more crucially, all important decisions in the EU that involve any transfer of sovereignty or additional funds have to be voted by a German law now. From a democratic point of view, I think this is something which is perfectly acceptable. But from a political point of view, it poses big problems in several perspectives. Obviously, the decisions that have to be taken in the context of the European, the Euro crisis are decisions in front of the context that I just explained that are hugely unpopular. And if you talk to deputies, even from Merkel's coalition, they say when they go back weekends to their constituencies, understanding for the way they voted on Greece and on the creation of the Euro fund is not very big. It's not a vote winner, the opposite. But it's also important in the sense that by granting Bundestag not only the right but the obligation to vote on all important European decisions by a national law, the Constitutional Court in a way elevated itself into the position of a European court, because no European decision can be taken without German consent, especially decisions on the magnitude of those that we saw last year. German participation is crucial. A rescue fund or aiding Greece without Germany would not have been credible on the market. So the Constitutional Court really is now a factor. If you talk to people in Brussels, they say the Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe is more often mentioned in policy debates than the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, because it is really now a constraint under which everybody who's participating in a discussion is operating and takes into account. Turning to the current debates around the governance of the Eurozone and the ECB candidacy, I think there are a couple of things, important things to say. Mrs. Merkel had, if you want to call it a strategy or a tactic, was that given the lack of legitimacy around the Euro project, she wanted to put in place the successor to Jean-Claude Trichet, the current ECB president, with a German candidate, and her candidate obviously was Axel Weber. I think the thinking behind that is not sophisticated, but rather obvious and simple. There is a serious political marketing problem for Merkel, and by being able to say, okay, we have done many things that you voters consider problematic, some of them perhaps you consider even illegal. But you can be relaxed. I'm here to look over that, and on the ECB, the most important and most powerful institution in the Eurozone, we have Axel Weber, who is looking after things, and we'll see that all goes well. I think that was basically the argument for her to do that. And now with the decision by Axel Weber not to stand for candidacy and to leave the Bundesbank in April, this has collapsed, obviously. What is interesting to understand, especially, I mean, if you're from a country like France, for example, or the UK, I think it would be difficult to imagine that Mervyn King or Christian Noyer, being in a position to succeed to Jean-Claude Trichet, just says, I'm going away, I go back to academia, or I run a private bank, without even bothering to tell President Sarkozy or Prime Minister Cameron. In Germany, that's what happened. Merkel did not know about it, and the communication was, as you may have followed, a catastrophe. And what was in the beginning going to be an argument a sales argument for the euro and for the reforms turned out to be the opposite. It further delegitimized the whole thing. So there really is a big problem, even increased problem for her now, added to the difficulties that she has domestically, independently of the debate around the euro, that puts a huge amount of pressure to her. There is an excellent candidate. I personally think he's the best one available, and I wrote an op-ed saying this, who is the gentleman here on the picture. The problem is this sentence, which was once again in Bild, which reflects accurately the prejudice with which Mario Draghi, who is probably the most qualified central banker we've ever had, even more qualified than Mr. Trichet was 7 years ago when he acceded to the post, has to fight with. It's prejudice, it's chauvinism, and in a way it's racism, but it's reality. I would personally presume that there is not really any choice, because if you look at the other candidates, they are honorable men, but they are unconvincing compared to Mr. Draghi. They are second or third rate candidates if you compare them with Mr. Draghi. But Mrs. Merkel will have to find a way to communicate, if she agrees to Mr. Draghi, to communicate this, and this is going to be really difficult. It's not going to be easy for her to sell Mr. Draghi in that job, given that his deputy is from Portugal, and the president of the European Commission is from Portugal as well. It's not going to be a sales argument for the euro, that is sure. That brings me to my last point, the euro governance aspect. I think the issues that are on the table now that will be decided in March at the Euro Summit in the beginning and the EU Summit at the end of March will be dominated by Mrs. Merkel's quest to find arguments that will compensate for not having the ECB top job, and for being plausible arguments that she can advance in the domestic debate in Germany in order to reassure voters who are unsettled and upset with what has been going on for the past year or so. So what has been presented as the competitiveness pact, I think the content for Mrs. Merkel is less important than the fact that she will be able to sell it as Europe becoming more German in a way, despite the fact that if you look at the substance, a purely intergovernmental setup with a very little role for the Commission, and if you look at the history of setups like this, like the Lisbon Agenda, you cannot be extremely optimistic that this is something that is going to be hugely influential, or even in the sense of what is perceived as being German in the European monetary union, of increasing budgetary discipline and things like that. So I think we have a serious risk of ending up with governance rules that are far less than optimal, but which will be used as political marketing. Public opinion that may be even further disgruntled, at least in Germany, or Mrs. Merkel, which would be equally bad, would find herself in a position where she would have to veto Mr. Draghi for the ECB top job in order to bring in, I do not mention names because I don't want to hurt any one of the other candidates who I say are good but are not as good as Mr. Draghi is going to be. So my outlook is a little bit bleak, but perhaps you'll be able to convince me otherwise, and I'm looking forward to a discussion with you. Thank you very much.